Welcome everyone to the Rotary Club of Jacksonville Zoom at noon meeting. I will now call the meeting to order by ringing of the Rotary bell. We have an exciting program today. Thank you for all joining us. During this program, everyone will be on mute, so feel free to submit questions by utilizing the chat function. I also want to remind you that today's presentation is being recorded. Howard Wanamaker will provide today's invocation. Howie?
President Jerry, thank you. And everyone, please just join me in a moment here. Almighty God, our maker, defender, redeemer, and friend, we need your peace that surpasses understanding to guard our hearts and minds. Be our refuge and strength. Be our very present help in this time of trouble. Great physician, we pray for those most vulnerable to this virus, for the elderly, the weak, and those with chronic conditions, for the poor, the hungry, the isolated, for those already infected, deliver them from harm. Indwelling Spirit, empower your people to serve, to get wisdom, and live by it and share it freely. Give us all fresh confidence that you are ever present in our futures. Let us rejoice in the Lord, our strength. Let us take joy in the God of our salvation. Amen.
Thank you, Howie. It seems many of you are catching up and enjoying the networking prior to the meetings. Thanks for those who joined us at 11:40 again today. As we continue to move through this world of Zoom, we are setting up breakout rooms before and after the meeting for committees. If you chair a committee and need a meeting room, just as we do at the Omni, please contact Sherry in advance and we'll arrange for your committee to have a meeting. There will be a club social via Zoom this Thursday at 5 p.m. Registration is necessary to receive login credentials. Check your spokesman for details. Please be sure to mark your calendar for our district seminar on October 24th. All leaders and all committee chairs need to attend. We'll post a schedule when more details become available. I'm going to turn it over to our hands-on committee chairman, Pete Hicks, for a minute. He's going to give us an update on a committee. Thanks, Pete.
Thanks, guys. Well, we have our first hands-on event of, well, I've been a part of the club, of this club. We are going to do, I think Sherry's going to try to find the flyer, if she can. We're going to do a food drive. There we go. That's basically starting now until November the 20th or 21st. So we're going to partner with Feeding Northeast Florida, who can get the food out and do a good job of getting the food out to the needy to its best use. And I'm going to make sure that this this flyer gets in the hands of everybody. It'll be part of the spokesman. Everybody can reach out to me and I can send it to you. Our committee will organize and pick up food items. I have a lot of volunteers that have already stepped up and said they would be happy to come out and get, they would be happy to come out and pick it up, or you guys can drop it off to my office because we have a small warehouse on my campus that we're going to collect. So the Monday, the Tuesday of that next week of Thanksgiving week, we're going to organize everything and take it over to Feeding Northeast Florida. So when it gets closer to that event, if club members want, we are all going to kind of come together and pick up all those stuff. So what we need from you as Rotarians is to collect these items. So if you are in office, if you just want to do yourself, whatever we can, the more food, the better. They weigh, and I'll be able to, they kind of weigh the food after it's all delivered to see how much we've actually done. But I've sold us because I said we're the biggest and baddest club of any civic organization in Northeast Florida, that we're going to really bring it when we come to this to try to grab all these items. Obviously, these are the most needed items. If you have other items, it'll be suggested, we can suggest, but the biggest thing is start trying to collect. If you need anything, please reach out to me or reach out to Sherry. She'll reach out to me as far as flyers. If you want a box for your office to donate food for the Rotary, whatever is needed, I will do it. And the biggest thing is we will be able to, our committee will either come out and get it, or if you wanted to make an event and come by, that Friday the 20th or Saturday the 21st. I try to make it convenient for everybody so that you guys can drop it off if you needed to. So from now until we got well over a month, about a month and a half, we should be collecting food items for Feeding Northeast Florida.
Thanks, Pete.
Yes, sir.
Last year, during Tom Bryan's term as president, he brought back an old tradition of introducing the introducer. When Tom asked past President Howard Dale to offer something he wanted his fellow Rotarians and our guests to know about him, Howard sent this. I would like the club to know that I am proud to be a member of Florida's first Rotary Club, a club that raised $30,000 to fund shelter boxes for Haitians in distress after Haiti's earthquake, and over $500,000 to fund a mobile health clinic for low-income persons in Northeast Florida without access to health care. As you can see by Howard's passion for this club and what we need to do, it is a reminder we are woven by a shared love of helping those in need. Our collective resources and talents do so much good in a complex world, and I thank Howard and all of you who have a passion for Rotary. I present to you past President Howard Dale, who will introduce today's speaker.
Howard, you will need to unmute yourself. You should see an area.
Okay, does that do it?
Yes.
Hello? Yeah. Okay. Good morning. Thank you for those kind words. Jerry, yeah, I'm proud to be a member of this club. We all believe in service above self. We can't do everything, but we can do something, and by golly, we can do it together and be more effective, but thanks. So President Jerry, guests and Rotarians, it is my privilege and honor to introduce our speaker today, James B. Crooks, Jim Crooks, Professor Emeritus of History, University of North Florida. Jim Crooks is a recognized expert on the history of race relations in Jacksonville. He entitles his remarks today, quote, Jacksonville Race Relations, A Tale of Two Cities. A little bit about Jim and his background. I'll be brief. His resume is on the website. Jim was an Army paratrooper for 2 years while he was in college. He got his BA degree from Yale University and an MA and PhD, all in history, from Johns Hopkins University. Jim and his wife, Laura, moved to Jacksonville in 1972 when he joined the faculty at UNF. And he has been a full professor of history at UNF from 1972 to 2001. And since 2001, he has been Professor Emeritus. Jim has authored 2 books on Jacksonville history. One, you'll see on the website, there it is, it's on your screen, Jacksonville After the Fire, 1901-1919. And the second one, which you can see, Jacksonville, the Consolidation Story from Civil Rights to the Jaguars. He has received numerous awards for excellence in teaching and for his advocacy of diversity and social harmony. He has been active in a number of community groups and served on the board of the Jacksonville Human Rights Commission, JCCI, Jasmine, and others. You know the old saying, when you talk to an expert, I don't care how much you know until I know how much you care. Well, Jim Crooks knows a lot and he cares a lot about this community. And that's why I'm honored to introduce Jim Crooks to you today. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm glad to be here. Thank you, Howard, for the introduction. Very generous. I appreciate the opportunity to come and talk. I'm going to mark down the time so I don't talk too long. You know, professors can be verbose. And if I haven't had students in front of me for a few years, I might get too verbose. But anyway, my original idea was to pick up on the history of race relations in Jacksonville, really right after the Civil War, because there's a really good story of what happened here from the beginning of Reconstruction up until the First World War. Many of us hadn't realized that the population of Jacksonville from 1870 to the First World War was majority African American. And thousands of people came here after the war seeking economic opportunity, much as immigrants came from Europe seeking opportunity all over the United States. And in the process, there was a lot of interesting developments taking place here. We had the first two Black millionaires grow up in this period of time. A.L. Lewis in the African American Life Insurance Company, and Joseph Blodgett, after Blodgett Holmes has been named, who was a contractor who got successful after the Great Fire, rebuilding much of the Black community. But there were others, James Weldon Johnson, an obvious one, and his brother, John Rosamond Johnson, and the great Eartha White, who some of you may have known in the end of her life. She lived into the early 70s, tremendous humanitarian. So you have all these, and in the process of being involved in economic development, they of course weren't as affluent as their white counterparts here in Jacksonville, but they, at least by 1910, 10% of the Black community could be considered white collar workers. And there was a diversity there that we often don't think of when we think of the African American community. But in the process of wanting to becoming involved economically, and they did it through small businesses, and they had their own hospital, their banks, their medical, other practices. And in the process, they also wanted to get involved in politics. And back then, Blacks were Republicans, the party of Abe Lincoln. And along with the minority of whites who were Republicans and the Blacks, they actually won the 1887 municipal elections in Jacksonville and took over city government. 5 African Americans were on city council, elected in 1887, plus the Republicans making up a majority. There was their municipal court judge was an African American. The head of the police board was African American, and there were 29 Black cops on the Jacksonville police force. So you had Blacks becoming a major player, but there was a backlash to this because the Democrats who had been in power, and as many of us know, remained in power up until probably the 1970s, didn't want Black leadership or Black participation. And out of Tallahassee, there quickly grew opposition to having a city council with majority Black and Republican participation. The yellow fever epidemic took place in 1888, and the city government became the scapegoat. Many people left town to escape it. And the blame for the inability to combat yellow fever fell on the local government, many of whom were African American. The result was that the legislature and the government removed the city council and the mayor from control of Jacksonville and appointed their own leadership. They could do this because they created the city back in the 1840s. And that lasted for a couple of years. And then finally, when an election took place in 93, the then reconfigured constituency of Jacksonville, for example, the Constitution of 1885 introduced the poll tax, which affected poor voters, Black and white, probably disproportionately Black. And the result was that by 1893, when we regained self-government, it was all white government and would essentially stay that way into the 1960s. So you have this attempt to achieve full citizenship in Jacksonville, economically and politically, being rebuffed at the state level and the local level at the end of the 19th century, leading into the whole series of Jim Crow laws that were passed, segregating schools, segregating hospitals, segregating everything from drinking fountains to taverns. So there was a period of time from the First World War up until the 1960s when it was strictly Jim Crow, when you had 2 separate communities here. They interacted at times, but always in a power versus relative powerless situation. For example, when Hayden Burns was mayor in the 1950s and early 60s, He appointed the first black police officers, but they could not arrest a white person. If they corralled a white thief, they had to call into the police department and have a white cop come out to make the arrest, because they were not allowed to do that. And they didn't meet with the white police. They met in their own little station at Blodgett Helms on the north side. So you have this period of time leading up to the 60s, and we all are familiar with the civil rights movement, and now Black Lives Matter. Nationally began with Brown versus Board of Education on school desegregation, or it may have begun in Montgomery, Alabama, with the attempt to the bus boycott. But here in Jacksonville, we marked the beginning of the civil rights movement with Axe Handle Saturday in August 1960, and we just commemorated that a few weeks ago. That was the beginning, and it continued on throughout the decade. There were outcomes of it. Again, it was a case of the Black community wanting entree into the public accommodations of the the whole community, and further down the road, housing, jobs, and full economic participation. Axe Handle led in time to actually desegregating the lunch counters that they were demonstrating at. And they provoked or prompted other African Americans at that time to get involved as well. For example, some of you may remember Frank Hampton, who was a black businessman on the north side. He sued to open up the public golf courses. There were a couple for all citizens to use. It was reserved one day a week for blacks, and that was the only time they could play. And when the federal court judge approved his suit, the city proceeded to sell the golf courses to private enterprise. So not to be just totally discouraged, Hampton then sued to open all of the recreational facilities in Jacksonville, the Gator Bowl, the Civic Auditorium, the Jacksonville Zoo, et cetera, et cetera. The federal judge ruled in his favor, and the city could not sell the Gator Bowl. They had bonded debt on it, and they had bonded debt on other public accommodations. So finally, you began to have an opening of public accommodations thanks to Hampton's suit. The efforts to desegregate the public schools at the same time was less successful. Earl Johnson, who was the leading attorney for the NAACP and a leader in the civil rights movement, began his suits in 1960. It took until 64 for federal judge Brian Simpson to tell the school board to come up with a plan. The first, I think, 11 black youngsters attended all white schools that fall. There would have been more, but there was a phone bank of intimidation persuading, if you will, black parents not to apply to integrate. But the 11 kids went to school that year. The following year, the home of one of those kids got bombed by 5 Ku Klux Klanners. So you have a situation where the white community is not, quote, welcoming the integration of the schools or the desegregation of other accommodations in Jacksonville. In 1963, the NAACP Youth Council, which was the energizing body. It's interesting that it was the kids back then and the young people today who've taken the leadership in protest, began a series of demonstrations to desegregate restaurants and movie houses and other places of hotels of private enterprise. And they had a big rally Easter time, 1963, that carried over to the Monday and Tuesday afterwards at the high schools. And it made Time and Life and Newsweek and other national media. Mayor Hayden Burns ignored it. He claimed it was just a little more exciting than the aftermath of a Florida-Georgia game. So he did nothing about it. But there were a few civic-minded Jacksonville people, Fred Schultz particularly, who many of you may have known, who put together a committee to meet with African-American leadership to try to come up with, okay, how can we desegregate the restaurants and the hotels and the other privately owned public accommodations in the community. And it get just so far into, maybe have 2 restaurants who absolutely wouldn't do it. And the other restaurateurs were afraid then to desegregate because they felt all their customers would go to the 2 predominantly the white serving restaurants. So it broke down time and time again. The Youth Council was pushing for jobs for African Americans, and they tried to persuade Southern Bell to hire operators who were African American. And 4 young women applied and all were turned down. Well, it turned out one of the young women had been successfully a telephone operator up for New York Bell up north, but she couldn't get a job in Jacksonville. So it sort of indicated the resistance that was ongoing to attempts to desegregate. That problem was partially solved, of course, in 1964 when Congress passed the first of its Civil Rights Acts requiring the opening of public accommodations to minority citizens and buyers. So you had the public demonstrations there. The next major effort came with consolidation. You know, the troubles brewing in Jacksonville had been ongoing for quite some time. High schools disaccredited, the law cases, indictments of city council members and particularly city commissioners in 1965, 66, 67, led to the founding of a charter revision commission under the leadership of J.J. Daniel. Daniel brought together wisely African Americans as well as whites to form the commission participation. People like Earl Johnson was, I think, vice chairman or secretary of the commission, and Sally Mathis, who was an active African American former school teacher, was involved. And they recognized that if you had consolidation, a city that was 42% Black would suddenly become only 22% Black, which meant, of course, even less political influence than they had before. So Daniel and his colleagues came up with a solution of guaranteeing district council seats so that at least there'd be 4 seats essentially reserved for African American candidates. And this, the Black participants accepted. The other major portion of the charter development regarding race relations was the promise of infrastructure improvements in the Black community. Studies done after the Second World War showed that the north side of Jacksonville had almost no development. The only paved streets were highways like US 1, US 90, State Road 17, 13, and 17. All the rest were dirt roads. There was no garbage pickup. There was no sewage system. It was just undeveloped. The result was that the commission members agreed to promise to bring the north side up to the same levels as the rest of the city with regard to infrastructure and city services. And for 50 years, that promise was forgotten in the white community. It wasn't until 2 years ago, when we were commemorating, 3 years ago, the 50th anniversary of consolidation, that suddenly we realized that we hadn't kept that promise. The Black community knew it all along, but the white community had ignored it. And so now you have movement at city council and elsewhere to try to compensate for the failure to upgrade the Black community after consolidation. So you had that situation taking place. With consolidation, every mayor since Hans Tansler up to the present has promised the Black community equal opportunity. And I, without doubt, believe them. The problem is in making promises come true. There have been multiple efforts over the years. There were minority set-aside legislation that was passed to make sure that 10% of city contracts went to either women or minorities. And they never met the goals. What happened in some cases with the individually owned business, the owner would turn the male owner would turn the ownership papers over to his wife. and then they could compete on the minority set-aside contracts. Elsewhere, they might put a puppet leadership in. So the minority and the follow-up on the law was it was never effectively enforced. So after a couple of years, it was just kind of forgotten. The same with the affirmative action effort. There were always a fair number of Black employees at City Hall, but they were all janitorial, custodial type jobs. And the goal was to have a proportionate number of African Americans in management and supervisory jobs. And so the push for affirmative action there produced some results, but nothing proportionate to the population. In a couple rare examples in the fire department, there was one very qualified firefighter, if I can find his name quickly, who was an Air Force veteran, a college graduate, been on the fire department for a number of years, applying for an engineer's job. And he took the civil service exam and passed it, but never got appointed. He finally went to court, and he went all the way to the US Supreme Court before the court was willing to recognize that the fire department's laws practices were discriminatory. I mean, that kind of opposition to having one person promoted was something that most whites weren't even aware of. The same thing happened in the same kind of thing happened in the sheriff's department, where they were investigated by the feds and threatened with removal of federal funding to the sheriff's department unless they came up with a plan to desegregate the police department. There were a handful of cops, one police officer who had no personnel responsibility. He was more of a PR position. And finally, there was one sheriff after Dale Clarkson who willingly put into play an attempt to bring the police force up to roughly 25% African American, reflecting then the community. That since has lapsed. But again, you had the situation across the board of how or why is the city unwilling to fulfill its promises or fulfill the promises of citizenship, where African Americans, as they had in the 19th century, wanted to be part of the action. So in 1993, I think it was the 25th anniversary of consolidation, there was a symposium held to ask the question, well, how has consolidation affected the Black community? What's the reaction of the Black community? Because I didn't mention before, back in 1967, the Black community voted in favor finally of consolidation by 60-40%, showing that they were as hopeful as the rest of the city that consolidation would be a substantial improvement over what went before. So in 1993, there was this symposium of, I think, about 12 different participants, 8 of whom were African American. And by and large, they all were highly critical of consolidation, feeling that Blacks have been left out, Blacks were barred, and they simply were critical. And these were not ordinary, these were leaders in the Black community voicing these opinions, reflecting their own experiences as well as those of whether it was their churches or their government or whomever they worked with. So you have this sense working all the way through the 20th century that Blacks continued to push for opening the door and entering civic life. And we all know individuals achieve this. There have been any number of individual African Americans, you know, whether you have an Adam Herbert, who was president of UNF, became chair of the Chamber of Commerce, or whether you have an Alton Yates, who played a substantial role in about 4 different administrations, or Gwen Yates, who was a department chair of the city before she was elected to city council. There have been a lot of successful individuals, as there are now, who do outstanding work But across the board, you have this sense, well, why not simply opening up? Why is it just sort of focused on just a few? Well, then you have incidents that took place. There was the incident in, I think it was around 1987, when 3 Black members walked out of a city council budget vote, destroying a quorum at that time, right at the end of the fiscal year. And City Council President Tilly Fowler had them brought back under sheriff's direction, and they voted. But the point was that there were 4 items in the budget of infrastructure, major infrastructure improvement, all of which were on the south side. And they say, why don't we have one, at least one on the north side? Why don't we have equity? And there are reasons why it was harder. The property records on the north side aren't as clear cut. There are absentee owners. There are confusing records. Anybody familiar with land use in the Black community knows that it's not clear cut. Whereas in the suburbs, you often have, back then, open spaces that were owned maybe by 1 or 2 person or a corporation that you could make changes relatively easily. But at the same time, you have the results, nothing taking place. Tommy Azzurri was mayor at the time, and he did manage to find money for one infrastructure project on the north side. But when quizzed, he said, you know, we've got to serve Mandarin as well as the north side. And trouble was they were serving Mandarin, full stop. The other incident some of you may remember was Chief Judge John Centora, who in the 1990s, in a taped interview with the TU, spoke out about how desegregating the schools had led to a higher crime rate in Jacksonville, or how mixed marriages were an abomination, or how all welfare mothers were Black. And you can imagine the reaction, not only in the Black community, but this time across the board to this outburst by the highest ranking judicial officer in the city. Tom Petway, who was then chairman of the Jacksonville Chamber of Commerce, took the leadership with Ed Austin as mayor to bring together the city to try to acknowledge that, A, this is wrong, B, we got to do something about it. And they had a series of meetings over 6 months, coming up with a series of recommendations of what could be done. Sadly, almost none were fulfilled. We have shelves of reports and recommendations at City Hall and Public Library, and used to be at JCCI when it existed, of things that could be done to make the city more equitable, but never quite get made. Which raises the question, why not? And over the years, you know, there's not a lot of overt discrimination. As I've said, all the mayors supported equal opportunity. But what happens is there are other priorities. Something else is more important. Something else requires the money that might have been spent in the Black community. And so you have the priority of equal opportunity coming in down on the bottom of the list rather than at the top, like most African Americans wanted. Well, that's one answer. Another answer, of course, is that there was limited money. Jacksonville is known as the lowest taxed major city in Florida. And, you know, we have story upon story in our history of how things did not get done and how our schools were disaccredited because we refused to adequately pay for public education. That story goes on and on, whether you're talking about parks and recreation or other areas, cleaning up the St. Johns River. So, you know, there are many reasons why change doesn't happen, but one of the major ones, I think, is that we don't prioritize. And now we have Black Lives Matter that has come to the surface in the last 3 or 4 years. Oh my goodness, I'm out of time. Very quickly, and it's come to Jacksonville. And the question becomes, are we going to do anything about it? Yes, we can rename Hemming Park, James Walnut Johnson Park. We can recognize that there were lynchings back in the 1920s that are totally wrong. We can support the school board initiative in the referendum in November for inner city schools. But the real question is, are we going to reach beneath the surface and try to honestly rectify what's gone wrong, not only in the last 50 years, but in the last 165 years? And that's the challenge for Jacksonville as we move forward in the 21st century. Are we going to continue on the road we've been with token progress, or are we going to look for equal justice for all of our citizens? Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks, Jim. We have one question that was submitted. Let me try and read it to you. This is from Chris Michaelakis. As a point of political science, how did social forces create a divergence of a typically conservative bloc of African Americans from the Republican Party? That's an interesting question.
Could you repeat that, please? I didn't get all of it.
It's a tough question. How did social forces create a divergence of a typically conservative bloc of African Americans from the Republican Party?
Oh, that's not hard. The New Deal did it. African Americans followed the party of Lincoln up until the 1930s and the Great Depression. And they've been making, as I said earlier, they've been making limited progress ever since Reconstruction. But then the bottom fell out in the 1930s. And it wasn't until the New Deal came and began to provide, for example, the only real help provided for blacks during the 30s were public housing that the federal funded, Blodgett Homes, Sturkeyville, et cetera, here in town. They provided some emergency jobs, but the city, with its own problems, again, prioritization, if you will, didn't provide any assistance. So the blacks shifted from supporting Republicans who didn't do anything for them to supporting the party of Franklin Roosevelt, which wasn't perfect. There was a lot of discrimination even there, but at least made the effort and won their votes. It happened very quickly.
So the second question is from Scott Eater, and it's, in your opinion, are community organizers and organizations doing all they can for in race relations in Jacksonville? If not, what is needed regarding these community-led efforts?
It's a tough one. Many of them are doing as much as they can, but always could do more. Let me just give a quick example. Some of you may remember Jacksonville Community Council, Inc. JCCI, the citizens think tank that was here in town for about 30 years, from the 70s to the early 2000s. They studied and found answers to many of the problems confronting the Black community. And they parceled out solutions to various organizations, and some of them were picked up and some weren't. But there was always a continuing pressure coming from JCCI to do more. And we don't have an organization like that anymore. We have good organizations like One Jacks, which promotes racial harmony, but nothing as hands-on as JCCI, or at different times. For example, when the Children's Commission was first formed during Mayor Austin's term, they pushed very hard for support for the Black community. And so did John Payton, when he was mayor, in his attempts to reduce crime. I mean, he formed, what was it, Jacksonville Together, the after-school summer camp programs that found not enough money. I remember being told, oh, that's a great program, but it only reaches 20% of the target audience. Well, that's a good first step, and the second step never happened. In fact, when the recession of 2008-9 came on, the money was gone. Again, the priorities of the city were, if you're going to cut something, you usually cut social services first. Not the police and the fire, of course, but other social services. And that's a short-term solution, but it's a long-term loser.
Yeah. So here's a question from Jenny Jett. This is systemic and nationwide. When/how can the people force the change, as clearly walking with signs does not work? In fact, I would guess many Americans really do not understand how systemic the disparity goes.
I would agree with that. And how do you move from protesting in the streets to, it takes leadership. It takes leadership in the mayor's office. It takes leadership in the governor's office. It takes leadership in Washington to come out and say, we're going to do A, B, and C. We're not going to do it all at once. You can't afford to, but you're going to begin a series of programs, and you'll do it with input from the Black community as well as from the white community to move towards particular goals. Right now, there's no leadership coming out in this way. I mean, about what are the first steps we should be taking? Now, there has been some leadership in City Council. The proposal to set aside a certain proportion of infrastructure dollars to go into the Black community. That's a very positive move, and I hope it takes place. The school board has taken a very positive step on their bond-ish referendum for November to try to upgrade schools that have been neglected for 30, 40, 50 years on the north side. Those are the kinds of things that need to happen, and they need to happen in multiple areas.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Jim. It was very informative. I wish I had more time to talk, but thank you for your presentation today.
Pleasure.
Be sure to join us next Monday for Zoom at noon. Past District Governor Tommy Grimes will deliver the eulogy for Rotarian Hank Baker, and we will have Dan Bennett from the Atlantic Council's Millennium Leadership Program as our speaker. He will be talking about the Leadership Accelerator for the 21st century. We are looking for a few volunteers to help with our club utilizing Zoom and website assistance. If you have some knowledge or are willing to learn, we'll train you. If you can help, please let me or Sherry know. At the conclusion of this meeting, our Zoom platform will remain open. Some of you are attending the board meeting and should see an option to join that meeting now. For the rest of you, and especially Jim, thank you for being with us today. We hope you all have a great week, and we'll see you at our next Zoom meeting. Again, this area will remain open. If you need to communicate with us, please type in the chat area of your screen. This concludes our club meeting. Thank you for joining us. Thank you again, Jim.